I'd like to introduce our chair for this session, our substitute chair for this session. Thank her very much. Tanya Sheehan was appointed Associate Professor of Art at Colby College in 2013 after teaching at Rutgers University and Columbia University. Her first book, Doctored, The Medicine of Photography in 19th-Century America, published by Penn State Press in 2011, takes a new look at the relationship between photography and medicine in American culture, focusing on Civil War and postbellum Philadelphia. Her next book, Blacks and Whites, Race and Photographic Humor, will examine the prolific references to race in photographic humor from 1839 to the present. Professor Sheehan is recipient of numerous research fellowships, including most recently ones from the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute at Harvard University and the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin. She holds an MA and a PhD in art history from Brown University. Please welcome Professor Sheehan.
Thank you. Is it too much to thank Amelia again? I don't think so. I think this has been an amazing conference. I've learned more in the last 2 days than I have in a very long time, which probably says something about me as well. But anyway, it's been wonderful, and we have quite a treat in store for us this afternoon. I'm going to introduce you to the three speakers, and then they'll come up to the podium. The first speaker is Anna Becker. She's a PhD candidate in art history at the Freie Universität Berlin, completing her dissertation on Twombly and Robert Rauschenberg. She has worked at the Daimler Art Collection in Berlin and at the Deutsche Forum für Kunstgeschichte in Paris, and it was in that latter institution that she worked on a major publication on the artist Max Ernst, which was published by the Pompidou Center in 2007. She's currently teaching at the Universität der Kunst Berlin. Chika Okeke-Agulu is Associate Professor in the Department of Art and Archaeology and the Center for African American Studies at Princeton University. He was a visiting professor of art history at Williams College in 2007, a Clark Art Institute Fellow in 2008, and a Woodrow Wilson National Foundation Fellow in 2010 to 11. He has curated numerous exhibitions of modern African art and contemporary African art throughout the world, too many to name here, but they are extraordinary. His books include, and are certainly not limited to, Contemporary African Art Since 1980, which was published in 2009, and the forthcoming title from Duke University Press, Post-Colonial Modernism, Art and Decolonization in 20th Century Nigeria. Finally, Peju La Iwola studied the visual arts at the University of Benin and received a PhD in art history from the University of Ibadan, both in Nigeria. She's had several group and solo exhibitions of her artwork. Her most recent traveling exhibition and edited book is titled Benin1897.com, Art and the Restitution Question. She currently teaches art and art history at the University of Lagos, Nigeria. Please join me in welcoming Anna Becker.
Thank you. Next to a wide open window through which the Mediterranean light of Rome comes in, Cy Twombly is sitting in a narrow room holding a musical instrument in his hands. Frozen in a gesture as if plucking its strings, the photograph shows the visual artist while examining the apparently handcrafted object and while making a sound. The picture briefly described here was taken by Twombly's colleague and travel companion Robert Rauschenberg in 1953, when both of the artists had returned from their 3-month stay in North Africa. It was especially due to this side trip to Morocco that the idea of a European grand tour, Florence, Assisi, or Rome, to give you an idea of the itinerary, had turned into an encounter with a plurality of non-European cultures that would prove crucial for both of the artists' future production. Despite of its casual look, Rauschenberg's photographic staging of Twombly can be read as a paradigmatic document that frames the central questions of this talk. For the instrument to which the picture draws attention to seems to duplicate, probably not by chance, structure, form, and material components of an object that I found in a catalogue of the Pegarini National Museum of Prehistory and Ethnography, thus the same museum that Twombly visited in Rome after his trip to North Africa. Second, Rauschenberg's picture documents how an object, probably first known from the distance, through the presentation and a museum showcase, is being transferred into the domain of actual use. By focusing on the direct tactile engagement or the reenactment of the instrument's original function, the scene with Twombly as its actor hints towards a new way of dealing with non-European artifacts and African material culture in specific. What we can see here is a way of handling objects differently, of making use of their essential characteristics that comprise not only formal elements, but specific material, tactile qualities, and in this case, even auditive dimensions. Accordingly, what we see scattered in the picture's foreground are such raw materials like wool or wooden sticks, materials that stir the viewer's sense of touch. Seen in this context, where the rented room of a guest house is transformed into a temporary artist's studio, it might even be possible to imagine that Twombly, who also was a sculptor, had built this instrument himself. From this photo, taken as a point of departure, we now turn the focus on Twombly's so-called North African sketchbooks. They date back to the same time when the picture was taken and, so it seems, established a link between Twombly and the musical instrument. On the basis of a close analysis of exemplary parts of the sketchbooks, I will try to discuss what kind of dialogue Twombly developed with the material cultures he first experienced on-site in Morocco and subsequently reviewed through the institutional lens of the Western Museum. To do so, I specifically ask in what ways the source material, the exhibits in the Pegarini Museum, could become significant for Twombly's own artistic approach and how he studied these objects while transforming and incorporating them in the medium of drawing. Although similar questions have been raised by scholarship on Twombly before, especially in reference to these sketchbooks, the subject has up to now been left largely unexamined, as the sketchbooks in their entirety were published only in 2011. Authors like Kirk-Varnedoe, who drew attention to these works before, were thus constrained to a limited number of pages when analyzing these works. As documented in the catalogue raisonné, there are, in addition to a few loose pages, 4 sketchbooks in total, and I show you of each one the first page. The upper one on the left side is preserved in a private collection, and the other 3 remain in the artist's former own collection. Apparently, they were seen as belonging together, as they all bear the same title, which reads Untitled and, in parentheses, North African Sketchbook. The semantic tension within this title, a word which refuses to assign a name in junction with an appendix that relates the drawings to a geographic as well as cultural area, is important here. Anticipating an aesthetic effect that runs through all of the sketches, Untitled North African Sketchbook creates an undecided situation between the unspecified and the concrete. Yet it was especially due to the latter, the concrete, that scholars were mistaken to think the sketchbooks were produced directly on site, an assumption that was corrected by Twombly only in a late interview with Kirk-Varnedoe. In this interview, Twombly related the sketches to pieces he had seen in the Pegarini Museum. The decision to visit precisely this museum seems, however, to have been motivated by his former travel. Appearing insignificant at first glance, this detail in the history of reception can confirm that the sketches are a mixture, a belated memory storage in which impressions from different locations and times were layered on one another, and at the same time, an archive that was fused with the actual experience of viewing an exhibition. It is this process of layering and interweaving that finds a striking correspondence in the presentational structure of the sketchbooks themselves. They are, with the exception of one, loosely stapled together to form booklets varying a number of paper sheets from 12 to 32. Through each semi-transparent typewriter sheet, we can see the faded drawing from underneath, the traces with either Conte crayon and or pencil that foreshadow what is to come next. The overlapping of successive planes here activates the ground and makes the shapes and forms, while turning the pages over, seem to move, mirror, and alter their positions, not unlike figures appearing and disappearing in a slideshow. This nearly narrative metamorphosis and interaction of forms operated through the mechanism of the book is characteristic for the first three sketchbooks in particular, in which Twombly seems to be studying configurations for later paintings. The drawings used for a specific medium become significant, especially when looking at the last sketchbook. It is annotated as a study for sculpture, and correspondingly, Twombly here deploys an entirely different visual syntax, a syntax that parallels the enumerating logic of a list. Hence, what stands out is not the shifting of one form into another, but the frontal and iconic depiction of each element clearly separated from one another. As a result of this quasi-typological order that appears closer to the way objects were presented and classified in the museum's displays, reading and seeing these 12 pages is made a little easier. Figures of the same shape are repeated with small variations either in the outer structure or in their inner pattern. Especially the pages in the middle are densely filled with fan or tube-like forms. Some of the elements can be identified. So, for example, the lozenge shape with 3 or more dots inside, here to be seen on the left page, second row. It is a recurrent motif in these sketchbooks, which, as Richard Schiff has shown, refers to a good luck charm that Twombly had seen in Morocco. Called after its resemblance to a pea in a pod, the quality of being a talisman, a material object that was believed to possess the power to bring fortune, apparently appealed to Twombly and made him use it for his own undertakings. Discovering a symbol of fortune in Twombly's inventory of things does not mean, however, that it is given a special or prominent place. Instead, it becomes part of the enumerative pattern itself, so that the former symbolic meaning is leveled down or even made invisible. Furthermore, it appears in one context with objects that have completely opposite connotations: spear or arrowheads, as well as other knife-like forms, instruments thus that imply violence and mutilation. On the right side, second row in the middle, we can see an idea of how spear and arrowheads could look like. Now, the Pegarini Museum possessed already since the late 19th century an especially wide collection of these spearheads, showing numerous variations from simple ones to others sharpened with barbs. As it was the museum's aim to provide the visitor with an idea of how different peoples actually lived, hunting equipment and instruments of daily life were given the same importance as figurative sculptures with aesthetic or religious value. Hence, when Twombly visited the museum, then located in the former building of the Collegio Romano, he could see a mass of artifacts ranging from weapons, clothes, cooking devices, musical instruments, and figurative sculptures, all arranged without hierarchies, but organized according to a geographic cultural provenance. The African exhibits, which were displayed in at least 10 rooms of the upper floor of the Collegio, were joined by rooms showcasing oceanic and ancient American cultures. The African section was actually, was actually located in this upper part of the wing, thus formed one part of a parcours reconstructing or recollecting diverse non-European material cultures. This panoramic vision, relying on a comparative approach, was also considered by Twombly when he wrote in 1952 while preparing his upcoming travel, and I'm quoting from his fellowship application to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, quote, "The 20th century is the great period of reevaluation of all known past cultures. The art of the Africans and Indians and etc. have taken their due places of importance in relationship to our own present cultural patterns. What I am trying to establish is that modern art isn't dislocated, but something with roots, tradition, and continuity. For myself, the past is the source, for all art is vitally contemporary. I'm drawn to the primitive, the ritual and fetish elements, to the symmetrical plastic order, peculiarly basic to both primitive and classic concepts, so relating the two," end of quote. Twombly's statement, which uses the terminology of the early 1950s and thus should be seen in this historic context, is programmatic, even though the rhetoric, the all-encompassing tone, is at least partly due to its function of being an application letter. Importantly, the here quoted reference to Native American art was retrospectively not confirmed as a, quote, serious interest, end of quote, of the artist. His attraction to African art, however, was also later explicitly assumed, and I just mentioned that he used to call his early sculptures of the 50s his African things, his early paintings, his voodoo things. Now, in order to set up a background, the passage first positions the artist within a wider period of reorientation. All cultures, according to Twombly, were now given importance in respect to one's own cultural situation, patterns, as Twombly says, showing his familiarity with anthropological concepts like Ruth Benedict's patterns of culture. Although Twombly's estimation might seem idealizing from today's perspective, it nevertheless documents his fascination with what he calls the primitive. And again, he takes up without further problematizing an umbrella term which wasn't used during that time. Like a zooming in, the statement then sheds light on Twombly's own artistic aim, which is to actively create relations between temporally and spatially distant things. One could also think of the term correspondence here. Now, that such a name also, and maybe necessarily, implies raising the degree of ambiguity can be observed in the North African sketches in an exemplary way, for they produce a double-faced effect. They simultaneously seem to refer to concrete objects and forms, and on the other hand, remain distanced from mere representing through their sometimes tumbling and stiff, sometimes volatile line. A line that contains en outre the characteristics of what Roland Barthes would later famously describe as gauche, as drawn with the left hand. Notice, for example, how the drawn objects can be swallowed up by an all-over drift to the upper right, here to be seen especially on the right side, and how they remain through changing pressure of the pencil, the index of a moving hand. Converging the mode of his line with the material characteristics of these things, their aspects in surface, texture, and fabric, Twombly creates and reproduces a thick and very precise vocabulary to qualify these nameless objects. Hairy, spiky, soft, or sharp are just some of the many words that could translate what we can see in these drawings. It is from this perspective, then, that the African objects can be understood as a generative model for working through the object's inherent materialities. Yet a procedure like this needs to be based on a specific way of reacting to especially the tactile qualities of things, a way of reacting that encompasses all senses and which was shared, not surprisingly, by Twombly's travel companion, Robert Rauschenberg. The picture shown here inverts the photographic situation that the talk began with, having Rauschenberg now drawn into focus while Twombly very likely pressed the button. The construction Rauschenberg is delicately arranging, it looks like he's braiding a horse's mane, is part of the so-called Fetici Personali series, a corpus of works that he started fabricating in North Africa. When seeing how Rauschenberg staged and photographed these ephemeral works when he was back on Rome, it quickly becomes evident that the title personal fetish was meant neither in a devaluating sense nor charged with any elaborate Marxist or Freudian theory. Instead, Rauschenberg was interested in creating a strange constellation of overlapping temporal spheres. By placing his works in the branches of a tree, he alludes to a ritual scene which at the same time presents itself as being a construction. Accordingly, to the same degree that he displaces a cultural practice maybe brought with him from his former travel, he also uses his assemblages as indices of wind and weather to reconnect a place that so overtly seems arrested in its own past. Especially when contrasting the marble bust of a notable person with a carefully weighed out mobile, it is significant that he covers the former's identity with a tuft of hair, and actually we can see the first letter of the person's name, and it is maybe not by accident an R next left to the tuft of hair. Erasing the sculpture's concrete tie to history, Rauschenberg instead binds the figure to the viewer's present by appealing, even through the photograph, to his sense of touch. Focusing on the expressive potential of materials and thereby emptying out fixed meanings, this strategy can distinguish both Twombly and Rauschenberg from a tradition of European avant-garde artists traveling to North Africa. Though these earlier travelers, Delacroix, Matisse, or Klee, stand primarily for an encounter of what was then understood as the Oriental, it is nevertheless with the example of Paul Klee that a brief background, a contrast, can be suggested for the younger American artist. For Klee, who went to Tunisia in 1914 and who during 12 days wrote down his travel impressions in a diary, it was, according to his own words, the studying of color and light that was crucial. Stylizing his last visit of Kairouan as a key moment in his undertakings as a painter, he proclaimed in an emphatic tone, "Die Farbe hat mich, color possesses me." Though Klee had worked with patches of color fields already before his travel, the sensual abundance he could study on site apparently gave him further assurance in his extremely balanced coloristic method. Structuring the picture plane like a textile pattern, the highly dissolved watercolors produce an airy, subtle, and translucent quality. Focusing on luminosity and tonal gradations within nature and landscape, the aesthetic effects Klee produces here tend to show color as nearly immaterialized. Thus, they seem to distance color from its physicality. Comparing this approach to Twombly, it becomes evident that the latter apparently takes an opposite direction. For even when Twombly explicitly notates his colors through words, he speaks of earth colors, such as dust, black, brown, and faded sienna, colors that overtly present themselves as matter. Against the logic of transparency, watercolor, for example, Twombly, even when he mentions white, underlines its matte appearance, its powdery substance. Chalk white, he notates, and by this anticipates his favorite ground in later painting. It is this tendency of marking material differences that is taken further when turning to the last sheet of the sculpture booklet. Indeed, having already filled his last typewriter page, Twombly arrives at an opaque, apparently thicker sheet. He starts filling this page with drawings too, however, having written down several times before such words as nails or brass tacks, he now switches to use these references as actual tools. Scratching into the ground a row of repeated punctuated lines, he subtly, so it seems, mutilates his support, and by this transforms the materialities of things into active parts within his making. When looking for the context in which these incisions appear, we find next to Twombly's centrally placed marks a row of vertical tubes with spikes. They are headed with sacred substance, the attribute, again indicating an interest in the idea of a somehow powerful material. Though it remains unclear to what these labeled tubes precisely refer, there seems to be a curious coincidence when we ask what is done and with which materials. The museum possesses several Congolese power figures which were shown during the time of Twombly's visit. The Minkizi, to use the original name, are part of a ritual practice regarded as material conductors of an exterior power. Their wooden surface is covered with nails, and in the middle of their bodies, they contain something too that is described as sacred or magic substance. Even though Twombly significantly did not draw anything that likens the shape of a human figure, and therefore the connection to these objects must remain on the level of corresponding users of material, it nevertheless seems significant that he was exposed to objects like these, objects on which material alterations and intrusions were actually performed. A group of monotypes produced when back in New York by using cardboard scored with a nail show that it was precisely the scratching of the picture's surface, the activating of its ground, that Twombly further pursued. Prefiguring what he applied in his contemporaneous as well as later paintings and what since then has often been called graffiti, here can be detected in its experimental phase. An incising, first of all, and simple as it might seem, it brings with it an arsenal of how making materials speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Amelia, and thank you for coming to today's and this afternoon's section of what has been an inspiring symposium. So this is part of an ongoing engagement with the work of mostly African, but in this particular case, African-American artists who did an amazing body of work during the 1960s, 1950s and 60s in Nigeria in the years after political independence. In 1964, Jacob Lawrence visited Nigeria for the second time, spending many months in Lagos and at the Mbari Artists and Writers Club in Ibadan. He also visited the Mbari Mbayo Club in Osogbo. Lawrence's encounter with Lagos and Osogbo, I want to propose. Is it possible to turn down the lights? It's washing the slides. A little bit. Thank you. I want to propose that this encounter, this visit to Lagos, Ibadan, and Osogbo radically transformed, if for a moment, his approach to color, pictorial design, and painting. But it was not, as one might expect, and I'm thinking back to the exhortation for African American artists to look to African arts for inspiration, I'm suggesting that, contrary to this expectation, it was not the esteemed traditions of Yoruba sculpture or other Nigerian plastic arts that inspired or influenced the style of Jacob's 1964 paintings. Rather, it was the visual character of contemporary life in southwestern Nigeria that provided him with an unprecedented palette and a new spatial sensibility, as well as a greater confidence in handling intensely complicated pictorial composition. My task in this short presentation is to show the extent to which Lawrence's encounter with the African marketplace catalyzed the intense visual and phenomenological experience he translated to his Mbari paintings. Now in the talk, I'll be switching between Mbari paintings and Ibadan paintings, because the Mbari Club was in Ibadan and a second Mbari Club in Osogbo. And he was in both places during these visits. While Lawrence was not the first major African-American artist to visit Nigeria on an artistic journey, and one can think of John Biggers, for instance, who visited parts of Nigeria and West Africa in 1957, Lawrence was the first in Nigeria on an extended stay, and in the process participated in the making of a most thrilling period of unprecedented African modernist efflorescence in art and literature. Lawrence's trip to Nigeria was initiated by Uli Bayer, the German-born critic and writer who co-founded the Mbari clubs at Ibadan and Osogbo. Bayer first encountered the work of Lawrence in that historic 1941 Fortune magazine feature of the artist's The Migration series, and had carried the publication with him for many years, taken by the power of the images. So when in 1956 at the first Congress of Negro writers and artists in Paris, he heard Cedric Dover present artists, including Lawrence, that were featured in his survey, American Negro Art, which will come out in 1960. Bayer became even more determined to seek out and make the artist's acquaintance. And the opportunity came after the Nigerian independence in 1960, during which the Lagos office of the recently established American Society of African Culture, they organized an art festival with the poet Langston Hughes and the musicians Louis Armstrong, Nina Simone, Odetta, Lionel Hampton, and Randy Weston, among others, as key guests. With no visual artists among the visiting African Americans, Bayer proposed to AMSAC an exhibition of Lawrence's work to be co-hosted by the Mbari and AMSAC. That exhibition, quite likely the first by an American artist in Nigeria, opened on November 1, 1962 in Lagos and traveled to Ibadan with selected works from the artist's Migration series, as well as from the War series of 1946 and 47. Lawrence's visit was brief in 1962, lasting only 10 days, but he had seen enough of Yoruba culture and enjoyed the robust cultural and intellectual atmosphere, particularly at Ibadan and Osogbo, where Bayer had earlier in the year co-established now the second Mbari Mbayo Club, what would be the Mbari Mbayo Club along with the Yoruba dramatist Duro Ladipo. This experience, as Lawrence wrote 2 years later, was enough for him to plan a return for a longer visit in order, according to him, quote, to steep myself in Nigerian culture so that my paintings, if I'm fortunate, might show the influence of the great African artistic tradition, unquote. Thus, in 1964, he returned to Nigeria with his wife, Gwendolyn Knight Lawrence, after several failed attempts to get approval from the United States government that had become increasingly suspicious of artists like Lawrence, who, due to the nature of his contacts and work, might have been a communist civil rights radical. So during this second 8-month stay in Nigeria, Lawrence and his wife lived first in Lagos and later in Osogbo, where they resided on the top floor of Ulibaya's magnificent 41 Ibokun Road home. It was here that Lawrence, produced at least 10 mixed media paintings and several drawings, which he exhibited in Mbari, Ibadan in October 1964, and at the Terry Dinton Fast Gallery in Chelsea, New York in January 1965. Upon his return trip, that is the 1964 trip, or rather about his return trip, Lawrence wrote, and I quote him at length because this is important. 2 years ago, in November 1962, I was invited to have an exhibition in Nigeria, an honor accorded me by the American Society of Art and Culture and the Mbari Club of Artists and Writers. It was my first trip to Nigeria, indeed, my first visit to the continent of Africa. As a painter, the visit to a country which had made so great a contribution to modern art was an experience of great value. As an American Negro, I had looked forward to this experience with excitement and curiosity. The visit in 1962 was so stimulating visually and emotionally that I have returned to paint my impressions of Nigeria. I hope sincerely that these paintings are of a social statement of some value, unquote. While we are not sure what Lawrence meant by the expectation that the Mbari paintings be seen as, quote, a social statement of some value, what the paintings show, I would like to argue, is not so much the acute sensitivity to the social, political environment that we see in his previous work as his dramatic and impressionistic response to what must have been an unfamiliar sensory intensity of the southern Nigerian urban environment, particularly the marketplace, which is that charged arena where human and metaphysical, living and inanimate forces jostle and collide amidst the exchange of goods and circulation of sounds, colors, and forms. Marked by an unprecedented palette of intense color, of cobalt, cadmium red and yellow, and contrasting black and white, these pictures capture the dense, brashly colorful, and chaotic Ibadan and Osogbo urban landscape teeming with humans and animals, and as we'll see, sheep, roosters, lizards, and even flies. as well as goods and ritual sculptures. All these populate seemingly unplanned, bewildering layout of markets and streets bounded by corrugated and rusting zinc roofs. One of these paintings, Antiquities, however, and this is the only work, as far as I can tell from the series, that is a single, if you will, portrait of a woman with a large headscarf carrying or simply standing behind a large tray on which we find 8 humanoid skulls, 3 carved figures, and 7 small spherical objects that might be amulets. The woman's gaze is turned down, fixed on her wear, while 2 lizards at the top upper picture occupy the only free space in this densely packed composition. In many ways, this is a disconcerting picture, not so much because of what it represents, as for its complexly composed pictorial space and color, 2 elements that characterize this body of work. To be sure, our attempt to comprehend this work as a compositional whole seems perpetually deferred by the tension arising from the singularity of the woman's imposing body and the many spherical and irregular shapes describing skulls, sculptures, and lizards. Moreover, he accentuates the sense of compositional chaos by deliberately leaving out large areas of white paper ground, and by the juxtaposition of fitfully gradated shapes of color. Although the artist devised this method of paint application, along with the prominent use of the white ground around 1962, in this painting, as well as in another from the series Iyo, in the Ibadan series, he carried this style to what seems to be its sensorily taxing limit. Compositionally, Antiquities, which I should note is the simplest work in the Ibadan series, is also remarkable in terms of its subject matter. Patricia Hills has suggested that what she calls the frontality of this composition suggests the act of presentation and is thus reminiscent of the 1963 painting Clown, which he did shortly before he left for Nigeria. However, the compositional and formal differences between the 2 paintings, such as the somewhat surreal arrangement in Antiquities of disparate objects and the fragmentation of the composition into several autonomous elements, as well as the proliferation of unpainted areas, trump whatever similarities Hill suggests among the 2 paintings. What is more, the title Antiquities must strike us as enigmatic, no less because of our uncertainty about what the picture truly represents. While it is tempting to take the 3 carved figures, and you see those, that there and there. While it's tempting to take the 3 carved figures which might stand in for African sculptural heritage as the subject of this work, I want to argue that the artist presents us with a much more conceptually dense image than the title suggests. For here is a painting in which the central figure is arguably a postmenopausal woman who, in the context of Yoruba cosmology and social practices, represent the core of traditional Yoruba collective subjectivity. Shown with the two flanking lizards, the woman holds forth and embodies the world of the Yoruba, represented by the three carved Ibeji twin figures, skulls that might be used for powerful rituals, and the 7 amulets, all placed in the oval platform reminiscent of the Ifa divination tray, that gateway to the minds of the gods. The painting is thus not just about the past, as the title seems to suggest, or about the mere act of presentation, as Hale points out. Rather, Lawrence constructs an enigmatic visual schema of the Yoruba world. Other paintings in the series are far more complex in both their formal aspects, if not in terms of their conceptual densities. A good number are scenes from the Ibadan and Osogbo and Lagos marketplaces. And the marketplace I'm still suggesting is that quintessential public sphere and center of social, economic, and ritual life among the Yoruba and many other African societies. It is impossible to think of a better subject for a keen observer committed to representing life in contemporary Ibadan and Lagos, and of course Osogbo, in all its colorful, bewildering, phenomenological fullness. Lawrence's 4 Sheep is exemplary of the market scene paintings. This densely packed picture, dominated as it is by the disembodied and terrifying cow skulls at the center, is a visual encyclopedia of the Yoruba market, complete with the stock characters, nursing women with children on their backs, women huddled around a fish seller's table. You can see those women with the bags and nursing and so forth. But these also include foodstuff and ritual wares and live animals, textile stalls, and so on. The 4 sheep referenced in the title are more or less lost in the crowd. And if you look closely, see the 4 sheep there. Let us note that Lawrence achieves the compelling insinuation of the crowded space by compressing multiple views of the sprawling scene, giving the viewer what one might call an omniperspectival view of the marketplace. And the only sense of rhythm and pattern in the composition rests on the parallel bands at the edges, visually or virtually aligned towards the central space occupied by the large skulls. We see these patterns, these parallel bands, which are, in actual fact, Lawrence's shorthand notation of corrugated zinc roofing in several of the other paintings, including Meat Market and Street to Mbari. It is quite evident that the artist relies on the roof forms as structuring and compositional devices in these paintings. For the regularity of their parallel lines somewhat tempers the visual riot of the multitudinous forms, shapes, and colors, and at the same time creates a visual staccato rhythm that approximates the dizzying tempo of life in the marketplace. He also seems to use the corrugated roof as a signal marker of the Ibadan, Osogbo, and Lagos urban character. And it is not surprising that Lawrence's impression of Ibadan especially highlights the visual and compositional impact of the city's famously rusting corrugated roofing that was so powerfully invoked in J.P. Clark's influential but incredibly short poem, Ibadan, running splash of rust and gold, flung and scattered among 7 hills like broken china in the sun. The description of the city as a running splash of rust in this poem is significant, for many a visitor to the city will inevitably get to the elevated Mapo Hall, which is on Mapo Hill, from where the landscape looks like a sea of rusted corrugated roofs. Even from a closer view, the plunging low roofs of market stalls and the haphazard layout of the buildings simultaneously obstruct our view and structure how much of the throbbing life in the street we can access from a single angle. While I cannot say for certain that Lawrence knew of Clark's invocation of the rusting roofs of Ibadan in this poem, or that indeed he saw the city up from the Mapo Hill, it is clear that he fully recognized the contribution of the roofscape to the city's urban character. In this painting, therefore, the roof forms fulfill their roles as compositional and decorative elements, but also serve as shorthand expression of Ibadan's enduring feature. Let me return to color as they operate in the Ibadan paintings, simply to remark that color and pattern played an equally significant role in his attempt to register the visual impressions of life in these 3 cities. His particular engagement with color while in Osogbo and Ibadan is supported by the fact that he made, as noted earlier, several colored drawings, which is actually quite significant because up until 1964, as far as I can tell, he appears to have made only one other colored drawing. Moreover, although he occasionally made work in the past using a combination of strong polychromatic colors, the Ibadan paintings are remarkable for their chromatic intensity, and this, in addition to the breaking up of the picture surface into a myriad well-defined forms and color shapes, accounts for the visual effects critics of the work found disconcerting when they were shown in New York in 1965. Writing in the Art magazine of February 1965, for instance, Jacqueline Barnett noted, quote, "One of the main problems with these paintings is that each one is broken up into such small segments of color and image that any individuality in each picture is completely annihilated," unquote. But what the critic identifies as a major problem in these paintings, I would argue, is what guarantees their pictorial power and, more crucially, their value as important painterly accounts of Ibadan, Osogbo, and Lagos public spaces. Patricia Hales has noted that Lawrence tried out a new, though unidentified, painting technique in the Ibadan paintings. It is quite likely that this technique refers to the combination of tempera and gouache, which he had only rarely used, mostly during the 1940s. Clearly, he recognized the inability of tempera, his favorite medium, to convey the visual impact of the strong colors of tropical Africa. Thus, the reintroduction of gouache, which also allows for saturated color, as well as the use of black and white to modulate the impact of their intensities, results in what one might call the visual polyrhythm, a critic used to textbook laws of pictorial design might find disconcerting. I would actually like to think that the last thing Lawrence wished to convey in these paintings is the very idea of pictorial individuality Jacqueline Barnett hoped to see. And I want to suggest that the critic misunderstood both the images and the task the artist must have set for himself, which I believe is how to convey the profound experience of the communalist ethos underlying Yoruba and African social life. This is not the place to examine in some depth the ontological basis of this worldview, but I should note that as studies by philosophers, sociologists, and anthropologists show, individual subjectivity for the Yoruba and many African peoples is constituted by and through constant negotiation with other humans, spirits, and deities. And here is a kind of graphic notation of the constitution of Yoruba cosmos and the Igbo on the other side, the very complicated relationships between humans and deific forces and their dependencies, interdependencies. This is the essence of Ifekwolo Ifakusoya, a common Igbo adage, which affirms the belief that the self and the other are not necessarily opposed, but instead are signposts in a cyclical network of social, ritual, and cosmic relations. This way of thinking about subjectivity and community explains the famously controversial dictum about African personhood by the philosopher John S. Mbiti when he said, quote, "I am because we are. And since we are, therefore I am," unquote. Or even a Xhosa from South Africa proverb, "Umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu," that is to say, a person is a person through persons, which according to the South African philosopher Augustine Schutt means that the self and world are united and intermingled in a web of reciprocal relations. My point here is that the intense proximities of bodies, animals, structures, and things in the crowded spaces of the marketplaces, and by extension in Lawrence's paintings, have much to do with a conceptualization of subjectivity and attitude to the social arena that a keen observer such as Lawrence must have, at least initially, found so dramatically different from his own social experience. This attitude to individual and social space that I'm describing is pervasive because it is embedded in the Yoruba and African cosmologies, and we can see it not just in the displacement of bodies and objects in the marketplace, but also in photographs of Lawrence at the Mbari Club. And this was from 1964. That's Jacob Lawrence there, and the Ataoja of Osogbo, who is the king of Osogbo, and Duro Ladipo, the co-founder of the club. And this is quite interesting, the image of the slaves that we saw in Dr. Stewart's presentation, and the argument he makes about the stasis, the relationship between those intense proximities of bodies and the relationship that has with Bearden's collages, and the way the same kind of proximities function in this particular context, which is what I'm trying to argue for, both in the marketplace, but also in interpersonal relations. To think that this is the king and, everybody is so crowded. The sense of personal space is, irrelevant in the way that people thought about their, individualities. And this, I'm arguing, is connected to the problem that someone like Barnett would have when looking at this picture, these paintings in, the sort of chaotic and intense compacting of patterns and colors and all of that. So it's a way, the misunderstanding of the image in some ways refracts back to the misunderstanding of, different societies and how they imagine their ideas about subjectivity. I had dwelled so much on the formal aspect of the Ibadan paintings, but I want now to rethink my earlier statement to the effect that I was not sure about what Lawrence meant when he expressed his hope that his paintings be seen as a, quote, social statement of some value, unquote. If he relied on a painting technique, that is the combination of tempera and gouache that he rarely used in the past, if he changed his approach to pictorial composition by stressing multiplicity of disparate shapes, forms, and figures, and if he produced selective chromatic intensities through juxtaposition of black and white spaces of saturated color, he seems to have done so in order to articulate or convey not just the phenomenological encounter with Ibadan and Yoruba social space, but also the worldview that underwrites them. To rephrase Babatunde Lawal's statement about Yoruba art and metaphysics, the peculiarities of Yoruba and African cultural behavior underlie the pictorial poetics of Lawrence's Ibadan paintings. And it is in this sense that I want to claim that these paintings incomparably captures both the visual character of Ibadan, Lagos, and Osogbo urban spaces, but also their cosmological basis. Moreover, it is the strong connection between the artist's style and his experience of a particular cultural space that accounts for the uniqueness of the Ibadan paintings relative to his entire body of work. Lawrence returned to the United States in early November 1964 and never went back. But he continued to paint scenes informed by the Nigerian experience until at least 1966. Several of these, still rendered in tempera and gouache, depict Lagos, Ibadan, and Lagos scenes and market environments. Yet the stock, and also the stock pictorial elements, women, patterned fabrics, live animals, corrugated roofs, that we see in the 1964 paintings remain. But there is an evident return to compositional order, articulated by the more open, flat spaces and color shapes, and by the more orderly organization of the pictorial space. While writing about the painting street scene in Lagos of 1966, soon after he completed the work, Lawrence noted that it showed, quote, something of what we saw from the back of our house while living in Lagos. We found it exciting being in the heart of the city, unquote. There is no doubt then that the thrill of the encounter with Ibadan, Osogbo, and Lagos was enough to relieve it pictorially for 2 years after the experience. However, it seems as though the immediacy of that exciting encounter with Africa, which impacted his attitude to pictorial composition in 1964, had dissipated, resulting in paintings his critics, I don't know this for sure, but must have found more familiar and pictorially less exotic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amelia, for putting this together. Throughout this symposium, we've seen how scholars have talked about the influence of African art on the works of artists from America. And I opened this discussion by showing some of the works by John Biggers that Chika mentioned earlier, who traveled to Nigeria and Ghana in 1957, and the work of Mel Edwards, who keeps going to Nigeria to get inspiration from the culture. But I'm not going to be looking at artists that have been in Nigeria around the 60s, but to say that several American artists have visited Nigeria to conduct workshops and also to do their own art and to get inspired by the culture in the last 10 to 15 years. Not just American artists, but also artists from the African diaspora. Right on the top, you have Nena Okorie, who came as a Fulbright scholar to the University of Lagos, teaching courses in experimental art forms, and also conducting her own exhibitions in the Lagos area. And here we have Albert Laverne, who worked at the Obafemi Awolowo University. He made a very impressive monumental sculpture titled Mother and Child, which is placed right in front of the Natural History Museum within the university. Phoenix Savage was there a year earlier than Albert, and her proposal titled In Search of My Ori, meaning destiny, in search of my destiny, brought her to OAU, the university in Ife. She didn't do much in terms of casting metal, which is her specialty, but was involved in teaching courses in African American art and history to the students of the university. And this is quite interesting because most of the universities that offer art do not teach courses about African American art or history. And then we have the wife of Kathleen, Joseph Stafford, the US Consul General, who most artists in Lagos fell in love with. A printmaker, conducted a lot of workshops at the University of Lagos and also did her own exhibitions. And of course, Ruby Amanzi, who's involved in several projects at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. Now, I am going to look at the works of two exemplary artists, Brett Cook and Wura, Natasha Ogunji. Yeah, but before I go there, I also would like to show you some slides of some of the other artists who had visited. You know, besides the Fulbright, we have other artists who come in on programs organized by the US State Department, like Mimi Woolford, who recently came back from Nigeria. She conducted workshops with students, university students, and also students of the staff school, the primary school within the University of Lagos. And it's important here because this was her return to Nigeria after 43 years. Her parents had been diplomats in Nigeria during the period in which Chika talked about Jacob Lawrence and his work in Osogbo. Her parents, Richard Wolford, was a printmaker. He worked with Bruce Onabakpaya. And her mother, Jean Kennedy, was also opened up her house to exhibiting the works of several artists from the Osogbo school. And then we have Maria Kreitz, who did a lot of work in textile tradition, learning how to do tie and dye amongst the artist cooperatives in the Lagos area. Now, these are the two artists I'm going to be focusing on. They've done quite a number of works within Nigeria. And for me, this is important, not just in Nigeria to derive inspiration, but also to do projects that have impacted the contemporary arts of Nigeria. Now, These two artists are African-American artists who have carried out community-based projects in Nigeria involving various groups of people across social, cultural, and religious divides. Through their individual projects, both artists reveal the potentials of cross-cultural engagements taking place in Nigeria. Brett Cook, an artist from Berkeley, California, who also describes himself as a healer, was chosen and commissioned in some respects as a cultural ambassador to work in Nigeria. He was one of the 15 American artists selected from amongst 900 applicants across the US to carry out collaborative projects in local communities in 15 different countries across the globe. This was done under the platform of the US Department of State program known as Smart Power, a program emphasizing a people-to-people interaction using the visual arts as a tool. It was administered by the Bronx Museum of Arts in New York and the partner organization in Nigeria, the Women and Youth Art Foundation, which I'm very much involved with. The other artist, Wura, Natasha Ogunji, working independently in the genre of performance art, was awarded the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship in 2012. Unlike Cook, she was born to a Nigerian father and an American mother. Ogunji never met her father, who died in 2000. In 2011, she made her first trip to Nigeria to see her relatives. In the US, she's better known for her short videos, which draw on both personal and societal experiences in establishing links of memory and history in relation to Africa and the Americas using her body. Both the US Department of State and the John Guggenheim funding provided the artists with practical support and the social capital necessary to visit Nigeria to conduct such elaborate community-based projects. Beyond the national agenda for this project, Cook was more interested in the platform the Smart Power initiative offered for genuine community relationship. For over 2 decades, working in the US, he has used art as a form of activism and conducted collaborative art workshops in several communities within the US, bringing about social transformation at different levels. Smart Power was the idea of the former Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, who opines that the best way to advance America's interest in reducing global threats is to use what has been described as smart power, the full range of tools, diplomatic, economic, military, political, legal, and cultural. And in this case, the visual arts became one of these tools used to bring people together and foster better relationships between them. Cook's primary objective as an artist was to create a platform for cross-cultural exchange, not at the level of the Senate or the government, but that of the common man. His project, Sharing Culture, under the frame of the larger project, Smart Power, gives expression to common people through art creation, providing an avenue for mutual sharing of knowledge and experiences across people of different classes. Sharing Culture comprised a series of workshops that viewed art as a form of therapy, derived from the artist's philosophy that the final piece of art is only a summation of the processes that allows it to present itself. Working from the sidelines, Cook evolved a process that moved debate and casual discussions from everyday experiences into art spaces, creating a huge impact on a person-to-person level. Such an approach in the long term leads to profound changes in small communities. Cook worked with a mixed group of people, young and old, drawn from diverse disciplines in 2 different cities, Lagos and Ibadan. And the venue of the workshops, comprising photography, painting, and writing, were conducted at the University of Lagos. At the heart of his practice were also spiritual influences drawn from yoga, as well as other moralistic lessons, an approach new to many of the participants. His projects were in two parts. It was in two parts. The first part comprised workshops in Lagos and Ibadan, and the second part was the actual installation of the final work of art that emerged from the workshop and the closing ceremony in Lagos. While at Ibadan, he worked with young students from All Saints College, and he began by working the students out of the classrooms and onto the school lawn, a different approach to learning art that they were not accustomed to. This move from indoor to outdoors functioned metaphorically as a move from the closed mindset of things being done in the proper way in order to literally open up and to broaden the horizon of the students, of the children. At first, the teachers were a little thrown off balance by the exercise, but on viewing the progress in the children's work, they joined in, and that's one of the teachers actually standing to draw along with the students. And at the close of the workshop, the students enjoyed themselves so much that one of them remarked, and I quote, "I enjoyed the sessions very much, but I would have been happier if Brett could come teach art in our school." End of quote. The final outcome of the Sharing Culture project in Lagos was a wall mural done collaboratively with participants. Cook divided the participants into subgroups. Each group was given a camera and told to use all letters of the alphabet to denote what they think or what they thought best represented a community and collaboration. They went around the campus taking photographs of each letter, and at the close of an hour, they pulled their images together and collectively selected the letter T, which birthed the word togetherness. And this became the symbol of the mural that now adorns the facade of the Department of Creative Arts at the University of Lagos. The mural is now the most impressive and the largest in the entire campus, and is interspersed with inscriptions relating to interconnectedness and the spirit of participation over the 5-week residency. Unlike many other projects coming from the outside, Brett arrived in Nigeria without a template or a preconceived notion of what the final outcome would be. The mural systematically evolved from the Lagos community, which the people now possess, with a great sense of pride and connect to it in intimate ways. So you can see the close-up of the image there. 3 men and 2 women looking upwards, viewed from behind. Without being able to see the faces of the models, it is their body language, inferred gaze, and interlocking arms that convey the sense of interconnectedness and support that the selection of accompanying quotations complement. As we, the viewers, stand behind them, we come to see that they could be anyone and from any walks of life, anonymous leaders or committed community members who could just as easily be ourselves. Now that slide shows you the artist working on the image. Actually, this was in the studio because he had taken the images which the participants had done around the campus, took it back to the studio in Berkeley, and then blew it up into a very large format, and then brought the mural painting as segments, which he took back to Nigeria to install at the University of Lagos. Now, we have here the Vice Chancellor of the University of Lagos with the entire management team visit the site of the mural, and that's the artists welcoming them, as well as the students who took part in the workshop who also came to share in that event. And then we also had the US ambassador who visited a month later after the Vice Chancellor had been. And then we have students and staff of the department who put up a performance engaging the theme of the mural, performing for the ambassador and the team that came. The Sharing Culture project was a vessel for many shifts in the artistic language in Nigeria. The idea of co-authorship, alien to many visual artists in Nigeria, was highlighted. Art moved from being a personal expression of an individual into being more communal. The artist saw this project not as his own creation, but as one co-authored by the group of Nigerians who he collaborated with. And the dialogue was therefore multi-layered between America and Nigeria, as well as amongst Nigerians themselves. We also saw that the artists taught them how to do things that they had never done before, and there were new methodologies introduced. By painting directly on the surface of the wall, under the glare of the sun, Cook highlighted the limitations that artists put on themselves while making murals. His process of transferring designs onto a synthetic material derives from several years of experimentation in the US. The thin film bearing the design is then mounted directly on the wall, practically eliminating the old laborious process commonly used in Nigeria. And this new method was embraced by the participants. Now, we also find that the site has now become a beehive of activities. A lot of things go on, in front of the mural. It used to be a space where we have cleaners just sitting out there or students sitting down waiting for the supervisors. But now it has been transformed to a place where they have rehearsals and they do a lot of performances there because of the painting that has been put on the wall and has beautified that space. Now, this is the segments, that was mounted on the wall after the artists returned from the US, and find some of the participants putting them up on the wall. And here is the artist, and mounting the works, and these are the students who are doing rehearsals underneath the mural. Now, the artist laments that there has been no critical review of the Sharing Culture Smart Power project, and no review of any kind since it returned to the US. The Bronx Museum hosted a series of the videos made about several of the projects as a part of their regular first Friday of the month activities. There was no press coverage in Greater New York or written dialogue about the short documentaries or practices of artists anywhere, end of quote. Yet in Nigeria, the program enjoyed wide coverage in the media. The mural had remained a lasting image that continues to generate further discussions and dialogue within Nigeria and has helped in fostering friendship between participants and the artists beyond the span of the project. Cook concludes, and I quote, "While I don't expect my short visit to change the way people there work, live, and create for them, I was inspired by them and reaffirmed in what I do," end of quote. So we'll go on to the next artist, Wura, who had done earlier videos in the US titled An Epic Journey of an Ife Head, where she imagines herself as an Ife Oriolokun bronze head with facial striations, jumping across the Atlantic Ocean in a search for his ancestors in foreign lands. While Ogunji sets out from Africa, hopping across the Atlantic Ocean in a journey to the New World, she attempts reconnecting and reclaiming both personal and collective histories and memories. She asks, does homeland long for us? Her video clip becomes a reality when she sets out for Lagos in 2011. As an artist of Nigerian origin, Ogunji can be referred to as Omowale, meaning our child has come back home. Her first performance in Nigeria was carried out during her first visit in 2011. The performance piece, titled "Will I Still Carry Water When I Am a Dead Woman?" was inspired by the daily chore of fetching water in her cousin's house. She recalls that her female cousins and herself were expected to fetch all the water needed for their daily use at home. And here you find the artist, hauling containers of water in a very unusual way and dragging them along the dusty, busy streets of Ejigbo in Lagos. Gradually, the environment begins to take a toll on her frail body, the grit on the floor in friction with the artist's thighs. Very slowly and painfully, Ogunji struggles on her belly to drag this heavy load to her final destination. The thread tied to her ankles painfully rub against her skin. She struggles, turning intermittently, looking for the most convenient position to ease the pains of this task set before her. In between short breaks during this laborious process, the audience is mixed. Motorcyclists speeding past in dangerous proximity to the artist as she trudges along. Adults and children watch the artist, and invariably the troubles of a woman going through struggles in a beat to fulfill her daily tasks. Ogunji says, and I quote, "What is the tipping point in a society where people struggle to meet basic needs? When do people have an opportunity to rest, reflect, envision, imagine, and enact another way of being?" End of quote. In 2012, she did another version, and in this version, she collaborated with several other female artists, about 6 women, to express the invisibility of the woman in public space and advocates for better recognition of women's work through her performance. Her work becomes a platform for engaging the relationship between women, society, space, and politics. In this other work, she dresses the performers in what she calls a futuristic Egungun festival cloth. And these are quite similar to the group cloth, or ashwebi, worn by the Yoruba people as a form of solidarity and group cohesion. Just like the masked Egungun dancer, allowed to travel anywhere incognito and revered for his anonymity, Ogunji's Egungun women occupy a sacred, dynamic, and public space. The attention the performance creates derives largely from the mode of dress of the performers, as well as the manner in which they haul the kegs. The mere fact that women are seen commonly hauling heavy goods on their heads demands that the artist creates a different form of spectacle. And then she says, "I'm very interested in interruptions and disorientation. The fact that we are women occupying public space in unexpected ways is an immediate disruption. I want people to stop to look because they are seeing something that calls their attention in a particular way and not in a violent way." End of quote. As much as the performers cause a stir, some passerby hardly acknowledge them. This is the very point that reiterates the message the artist seeks to address. Oftentimes, women work so hard, and yet their contributions are hardly appreciated and largely ignored. Another work she did, titled Beauty, was inspired by the work of the Serbian, New York-based artist Marina Abramovic, and titled Relation in Time, and that's the work over there. Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay. So in this work, she looks at the whole issue of hair. What does hair mean? Women spending so much time doing their hair in Nigeria, and also talks about the trade network that exists underneath the bridge at Obalende in Lagos. So she also talks about the fact that these hair braiders, which she hired to plait the hair of the performers, actually exist amongst several other traders under the bridge. And there's always a competition for space. Sometimes you have people who come to extort money from them because they're not meant to be under the bridge. And in a sense, the daily haggling between the hairdressers, the salonist, and the extortionist becomes a performance. All 5 women stand for hours under the scorching sun at the bus terminal at Obalende. Quickly, they become the center of attraction. As people stare at them, they in turn look back at the audience. Both audience and performers become the spectacle. Unlike the audience, the performers are able to view all sides of the crowd and pull in more experiences, like the Yoruba trickster god Eshu, who presents several attributes at one and the same time. The 5 fused performers get a fuller experience of the event, capturing the comments and reactions of the audience from their various perspectives. Each part of the masquerade connected to the other is in a way that suggests they are separate but yet whole nature. The struggle of one performer to become more comfortable provides discomfort and destabilization for the other. Ogunji remarks, "My neck is still being pulled back by the weight of the hair. I adjust in small shifts. It is painful. I try to make myself more comfortable, knowing that perhaps I will make one of my sisters more uncomfortable. I have to trust that they will take care of themselves." End of quote. So while the performers are on, we have a huge crowd gathering around them, people filming and asking questions, and then the performers are quiet about it because they can't respond to them. And then we also have, this is a close-up of the shots, showing all their heads plaited together, showing their hair plaited together with hair extensions that they get from China, and they call them African hairstyles. And so while the performance was going on, we had touts coming to harass them, to say, what are you doing here? You can't be working, you can't do anything, you have to give us some money. And here we have one of them who was trying to extort 100,000 naira, which would be like $600, from the artist. And then she says, I am Nigerian. We are artists. We have a right to be here and express ourselves. End of quote. The power struggle over ownership of public space and the final negotiations that ensue throws up the very nature and character of performance in Africa, where the audience sometimes becomes part of the cast and invariably the cast becomes the audience. This participatory nature of performance brings about a measure of flexibility that is unpredictable. The performance gets extended and actually begins when it ends. The next work she has, very briefly, which she titled Queen, again refers to women in public space. And here they enthrone themselves as queens, right at the bar beach, wearing very extended crowns and sitting on raised platforms. And they sit there for about an hour, and after a while, they come down, and another set of performers wear the same crowns and go back again on the platform. And over time, some of the people who were looking at them also wanted to wear this special crown that was created by the artist and joined up with a strip of ashwabi cloth. Now, what are the benefits of this kind of interaction in Nigeria? Realizing that performance art is yet to infiltrate the Nigerian art scene, Ogunji conducted 2 performance art workshops within Nigeria. One at the Yaba College of Technology, which is a polytechnic close to the University of Lagos, and the other at the University of Lagos. Both workshops provided better insight into this genre within the academy and gave participants an opportunity to explore themes that derive from their environment. Art schools in Nigeria situate performance art within the sphere of the theater and performing arts. It therefore does not come under the mainstream aspects of the visual arts. So, that's the close-up, and that's the fast shot of the artist sitting and looking towards the Atlantic Ocean. Now, this is one of the artists, Jaleeli Atiku, who is known as a performer in Nigeria. Yes, I'm rounding up now. Thank you. Yeah. So she also collaborated with the artist and did a number of performances with him as well as working with several female artists she inspired during her stay in Nigeria. So the workshop which she had in Lagos, the participants brought up the theme of sexual harassment, and these are some of the performers who put on some of the tags, went around the campus, taking some of the comments written down on paper and stuck to the fabrics that the performers were carrying around the campus. But what is interesting here is that sometimes performances are not too far away from their realities. In a dramatic twist, exactly 5 months after Ogunji's workshop, students of the same department where the workshop had held earlier went on a protest rally, charting a similar path through which the performers had passed earlier. And even though the outcome of this performance workshop is totally coincidental, it is remarkable and startling. Both events are purely fortuitous. Ogunji's intervention was satirical, timely, and provident, and provoked reactions, challenged the status quo, and made suggestions by both participants and the audience in ways of breaking unhealthy structures within the school system. Now, one of the interesting things that has come out of her workshop is that she has inspired a large number of female artists. Names of artists that we didn't know before have emerged in performance art in Nigeria. And she collaborated with Ruby Amanze, who worked at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. And this work was inspired by the beauty performance that she had in Lagos much earlier, and some of the drawings that she had done, which is an ongoing work. But what is interesting here is that this collaboration has led to an exhibition that will open later this month at the Museum of Contemporary Diasporan Art in Brooklyn, New York. Now, Ogunji her projects in Nigeria emphasize the move from the concept of the gallery or the white box into public space, and she engaged largely on explored spaces such as the streets in Ejigbo, in Balinde, Bar Beach, Yaba, transforming these sites into a new arts space and freeing the minds of several artists who were either too confined by commercial gallery spaces. For both Ogunji and Cook, and I'm concluding here, coming to Nigeria opened up new possibilities of experimentation. For Ogunji, her previous engagement prior to her work in Nigeria were video shots that she took before the camera alone, but she had more robust and collaborative projects with several artists within Nigeria. And her stay was so fruitful that she has resolved to keep coming back to Nigeria for longer periods to do more work. And in the case of Cook, just as he did for the portraits, the armrest portraits, his work was a prime example of the breaking down of stratification between the teacher and the student, and in many ways blurring borders between different classes of people. So I'm going to end with the last slide, which shows the artist happily dangling from the scaffold where he painted the mural. Thank you very much.
So that we can keep to time, we're actually going to skip my comments. We're going to, we do have time. Yay, okay. Our coffee's delayed, so I'm going to give you some brief comments, 30 seconds, and then we'll have some questions from the audience. This morning's papers showed us how artists who were traveling abroad were learning a new diasporic language in that process. And I found that this session continues that discussion really nicely by talking about language and specifically by foregrounding the issue of translation, which we can understand as rendering from one language into another. And as we've seen in all of these papers, that work of translation often involves a change of form, appearance, and so often of meaning. And I was really struck, although each of these papers is very different in terms of its subject matter, they did use a series of words and verbs specifically to describe the work of translation. And I just want to read some that I was writing down as we were listening, because I think they're fascinating and speak to the variety of work that translation can do. So we heard things like refers to, relates to, corresponds to, but we also heard more active words like constructs, alters, intrudes upon, captures, approximates, and in the last paper, reaches across, connects, makes visible, and also disrupts. And what's interesting is that each of those words, depending on how you deploy them, can carry both positive and negative connotations, and I thought that was fascinating. But of course, we want to hear from all of you. So I think Amelia has the mic, and I see a hand on the right and in the center, right here. Oh, yes, please.
Thank you for your talks. They were very enlightening. My name is Nengi Omuku. I'm from the University of Ibadan. And my question is to Dr. Okeke. It was very good to see familiar images from Ibadan, especially the market, so that was nice. But the question is, though, I was wondering if Lawrence had any relationship to traditional Yoruba dyed fabric, adire, because are there any records to show that? Because the lizard in the antiquities image brings to mind that same adire. The motif of the lizard represents epilepsy and affliction. So it adds a doubly ominous layer to the image. And I couldn't help but notice in Marketplace in '66, there were some blue and white fabrics that the women in the market were wearing as well. So I was wondering if adire plays an important role in his work.
Yes, most of the floral motifs that you see across those market scene paintings are taken from adire. And I did mention textile stalls. In Osogbo and Ibadan, these are some of the most traveled shops where these women, really economically powerful women, who own these textile stores, and most of them are adire fabrics, which are of course tied to Yoruba sartorial identity. So that's a very important aspect to the imagery. It's not very clear because of the way that he depicted the lizards, because they are not flat, as is the case with the motifs that come from the textiles. So I wasn't too sure about the connection between the lizards and the kind of lizard motifs that you see in adire, which are much more hieratic than the way he depicted the two lizards at the top. But yes, the connection to adire is there in the pattern.
Thank you so much for these wonderful presentations. I really appreciate that Jacob Lawrence was greatly inspired and influenced by what he saw in Osogbo, Ibadan, and Lagos. But I also wonder, did he have a discernible influence on the artists in the workshop there as well? Did it go both ways? I was curious about that also.
I'm not sure about that other direction of influence. He was one of the many workshop leaders that came through the Osogbo workshops. Dennis Williams from Guyana, was there more frequently, and you had artists from Europe as well who came through the workshops. But I can't think of any of the artists that were in Osogbo in 1964 that one could see any traces of influence of Jacob Lawrence's work. But also just to point out that the workshop that he participated in was in Osogbo in 1964. The exhibition of his work was in 1962 in Ibadan. So most of the artists he worked with in 64 are not, wouldn't have seen his work in 62.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for organizing this talk. My name is Victor Ipuk. I noticed that throughout the conversation from morning till now, there's always been the mention of language and vocabulary and things like that, as it relates to an artist using this language to express themselves. It's really not a question, sort of a comment or observation from my point of view as a visual artist, who's also come from somewhere else to live in another place and still practice. In terms of using a language, I've noticed that several of the artists that were mentioned, came from a different culture and experienced another culture, but at the same time, they still use a certain language from where they came from as sort of a vocabulary to express what they observed in a different culture. In my own practice, people have often asked me about what it is that that is trying to make a relations between my work and maybe a lot of modern artists. But I think it's also very possible for an artist to still speak the vernacular of their cultural aesthetics, even while experiencing another culture, for instance. And it's not necessarily a bad thing to lose it, or to so submerge oneself so much into the new culture so that one loses the vernacular. I think the visual arts, especially, even if the new viewers may not understand the vernacular, that they could still appreciate it aesthetically. That's just a comment that I wanted to make.
So I'm sure that, and I imagine that Peju, you're going to get a lot of questions. So I'm going to throw my questions to Anna Grit, especially because obviously there are overlaps between my talk and yours yesterday. My talk yesterday and yours today, sorry. So, Twombly and Rauschenberg sort of head out to North Africa. And in that context, you sort of describe the Pegarini gallery and the Azande and Mambwetu objects, including the kissar, the lyre that we see in that photograph. So my question is, the American Museum of Natural History in New York, to which certainly Rauschenberg had access, and I imagine Twombly as well, is well known within the history of American anthropology for having an early 20th century, maybe even late 19th century collection of art precisely from this part of the world. And Enid Schildkrut published a book probably about 20 years ago at this point that really documents that project of collecting. So my question would be, 1953 is pretty late in relation to the history of that museum. First of all, whether you're certain that these two artists had not contact with the collection here in the United States, and to what extent the idea of travel within Africa itself, once it sparks off that kind of interest, resulted or not, given that they both came back, I mean, these were short trips that they both came back to the United States, resulted or not in a continued contact, therefore, with what was and still remains available right, I was almost going to say here, but right there in New York. Because I think there's sort of a tendency to forget that within this country itself, those experiences were actually already available. I mean, they went to North Africa. They did not go to Central Africa.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I'm happy that you asked it. I have to say that definitely Twombly and Rauschenberg, they were in contact or they had knowledge of African art before traveling to North Africa. From Twombly, we know that apparently he had a collection of books regarding primitive art. Concerning the Museum of Natural History in New York, I'm sure they went there. I mean, Twombly, for example, was just a museum goer. I cannot imagine that he wasn't there. And so I definitely think that they were exposed to experiencing North African material culture, not African material culture already before. Yeah, definitely. The thing with the traveling is I had the impression that the travel, exactly like you hinted, gave the possibility to collect themselves. That was the case with Rauschenberg, that was the case with Twombly. They started collecting materials. And this kind of material collecting was then, when they were back in Rome, continued by Twombly. We know that he went to this museum. For Rauschenberg, we don't know. Continued in collecting objects via drawing. So yes, I would say that the travel actually permitted to become active as a collector themselves.
We're going to break at this point and continue the conversation over coffee in the lobby. And according to Amelia, we all have to be back by 3:15, no later than that.